I never thought the most painful blow of my life would come from an illness or a death, but from the mouth of my own daughter. I was sitting at the back of the room surrounded by gold balloons and cheerful music when I saw her walk up to the stage, radiant in her blue dress, to give her thank you speech. It was her 35th birthday, and I naively expected to hear at least one word of gratitude. Just one. But what came out of her lips was a dagger that stabbed me without warning. She hugged her mother-in-law tightly, helped her up from her seat, and with the microphone in her hand, she said, "This is the only mother who matters to me." The entire room burst into applause. I saw the smiles, the camera flashes, the bright eyes of the guests. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she turned to me and added with that firm voice she had so often yelled at me with in private, "You can leave now." I felt the air leave my lungs. My hands trembled on my purse as I tried to hold on to what little dignity I had left. No one looked at me. No one defended me. It was as if suddenly I had been erased from history. I stood up slowly, my knees heavy, while my daughter watched me with that mix of contempt and triumph I had seen in her eyes so many times. But just as I took the first step toward the exit, someone else stood up, my daughter-in-law. But before I continue, I wanted to know if you have subscribed to the channel yet, and if you also liked the video. This helps me see that you support me and like my stories. Now let's continue. My daughter-in-law walked firmly toward the stage. She took the microphone from my daughter's hands, and with a trembling but determined voice, she said something that made everyone's blood run cold. "I can't stay silent. Today is your birthday, and yes, you deserve to celebrate. But you also deserve to hear the truth." The silence became so thick that not even the background music dared to continue. The guests looked at each other uneasy with that discomfort that only appears when they sense something sacred is about to break. My daughter, confused, tried to get the microphone back, but my daughter-in-law held it with both hands as if her life depended on it. "You have always despised me," she continued. "You have made me feel small. You have treated me as if I wasn't worthy of being by your side. But you know what? The real mother here is not the one who applauds your vanity or smiles for the cameras. The real mother is the one who was with you since you were born, the one who cared for you, the one who sacrificed her life for you. And that woman is standing right there while you throw her out of your party like she's trash." A murmur of astonishment swept through the room. I was paralyzed, barely able to believe what I was hearing. My daughter-in-law, whom I had always seen as distant as someone outside of my struggles, was the only one who dared to say out loud what no one else wanted to acknowledge. My daughter turned pale. She tried to laugh to pretend it was all a misunderstanding. "What are you saying?" she stammered. "This is not the time for your drama." But the damage was already done. The eyes were no longer on her, but on me. For the first time in many years, people looked at me directly as if they remembered I existed, that I was more than just a shadow in my daughter's life. I don't know how long that silence lasted. For me, it was an eternity. I could only hear the beat of my heart, loud, desperate pounding in my temples. And then I understood. That public humiliation I thought was my end was actually the beginning. I walked out of that room that night with my head held high and my eyes dry. There were no tears that could clean the wound, but there was a decision beginning to form inside me. Something had ignited in my gut. I could no longer allow my daughter, the child I had given my life for, to destroy me over and over again. The cold night air hit my face as I walked through the door. I hugged myself and I remembered every sacrifice. The sleepless nights taking care of her when she was sick. The times I gave up my own dreams to support hers. The years of silence so as not to embarrass her in front of anyone. All of it reduced to a gesture, to a few words of contempt into a microphone. As I walked home, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. My daughter had sealed our fate with those words. But my daughter-in-law, with her unexpected confession, had also opened a crack in the perfect facade of that family, a crack that I planned to widen until everything came crashing down. Because if she had the courage to speak, I would have the courage to act. That night alone in front of the mirror, I repeated in a low voice the words I didn't dare say in the room. I am not leaving. I am not giving up. And that's how it all began. People tend to believe that the love between a mother and daughter is indestructible, like a bond that neither time nor circumstances can break. I believed that too. Maybe that's why the pain I feel now is so unbearable, because I gave my entire self to a lie that slowly crumbled apart. When I think about my daughter's early years, my memory is tinged with tenderness. I remember her as a newborn with those big dark eyes that looked at me as if I were her entire world. I would spend hours holding her in my arms, singing her improvised lullabies while exhaustion burned my back. I didn't care. In every smile, in every first babble, I found a reason to keep breathing. I didn't have a happy childhood. I grew up in a house where the absence of love was our daily bread. My sickly mother could barely handle me, and my father, with his violent temper, unleashed his frustration on us. I swore it would be different with my daughter. I swore I would give her everything I never had: a safe home, a warm hug, a refuge where she could grow up without fear. At first I succeeded, but over time the roots of that promise began to crack. Her father. My husband was never an easy man. He was a hard worker, yes, but also proud and distant. He barely paid attention to the everyday details that I valued so much. For him, raising a daughter was a secondary task, a duty that fell entirely on my shoulders. He became the judge and executioner of my efforts. If she cried, it was my fault. If she got sick, I hadn't taken good care of her. If she rebelled, it was because I had been too soft. And she, my little girl, absorbed every word. She grew up hearing from her father that I was not enough, that I lacked character, that I wasn't up to his standards. At first, she defended me, but over the years, she stopped. It was easier to join him than to stay on my side. I remember one afternoon when she was just 12. I had cooked her favorite dish to cheer her up after a tough exam. When I served her at the table, she looked at me with disdain and said, "Dad says you're a bad cook." I froze the knife still in my hand. I asked her if she thought so too, and her response was a shrug, as if my effort was worthless. That day I understood that the poison of contempt had already taken root in her heart. The teenage years were even crueler. Every time we argued, she would repeat phrases that weren't her own. They were echoes of her father and later of her husband's family. "You're old-fashioned. You're a burden. You never gave me what I needed." And I, instead of confronting her, remained silent. I was afraid of losing her. I believed that if I endured, if I held on, one day she would understand everything I did for her. But that day never came. The appearance of her mother-in-law finally sealed my place in her life. That woman, cunning and with a gift for charming people, won her over with attention and flattery that I never knew how to give so lavishly. She had money connections, sweet words that sounded like music to ears hungry for recognition. My daughter began to compare me to her, to see in that woman what I couldn't offer. And every comparison left me more relegated, smaller, more invisible. Slowly, I began to notice that family invitations became fewer, that the photos she shared on social media never included me, that in conversations I was barely a footnote, and uncomfortable memories she preferred to hide. When did I lose my daughter? That's the question that keeps me up at night. Maybe it was the day I accepted silence instead of demanding respect. Maybe it was when I chose to be quiet rather than confront her father. Or maybe it was even before that, from the time the pain of my own childhood prevented me from teaching her how to love me. The truth is, as she grew up, I faded away, and when I tried to react, it was already too late. She had replaced me. She had found in another woman the mother figure I always dreamed of being for her. And yet here I am. Despite everything, I still feel love. A wounded, mutilated love, but still alive. Because even though she pointed me out in public, even though she threw me out of her party, even though she told me to leave, I am still her mother. And a mother's heart doesn't obey logic, but an instinct that condemns her to love even the one who hurts her. That is my greatest weakness, and at the same time, my greatest strength. Because that love does not mean resignation. On the contrary, it means I will not give up. That even if my daughter denies me, I have a right to the truth. And if she chose to forget it, I will make sure to remind her even if it hurts her. What happened at her birthday party was not an accident. It was the result of years of silence and contempt. But it was also the beginning of something new. because now I know that I am not willing to continue living in the shadows. If my daughter wants to bury me alive, she will have to watch as I rise from that grave and give back every word, every gesture, every ounce of disrespect. And I won't do it with screaming or violence. I will do it with the truth they fear that no one expects, and that will be my greatest revenge. Silences. If I had to describe my life in one word, that would be the most accurate. Because what destroyed the relationship with my daughter wasn't just the shouting or the arguments or the disrespect. It was the prolonged silences filled with an invisible poison that built up day after day until it suffocated me. At home, my husband was the master of words, and I learned too early that contradicting him was useless. He imposed his version of life, and we both, my daughter and I, had to accept it. The terrible thing is that over the years, she not only accepted it, she admired it. He became her model of authority, her point of reference. I, on the other hand, was relegated to the role of a secondary figure, a dull backdrop. I remember one dinner in particular. My daughter was about 16. The three of us were at the table, and she was excitedly talking about wanting to study music. She had talent. Since she was little, she had a sweet voice and a sharp ear. I encouraged her. I told her she should follow her dreams. But her father laughed with contempt. "Music," he said with that voice that chilled the air. "Music doesn't put food on the table. That's for mediocre people. You will study law like your cousin." I tried to intervene. "Let her choose, don't force her." He stared at me, and before I could continue, my daughter interrupted me. "Dad is right. You don't understand." And silence fell over me, heavy as a wall. That was just one example among many. Every time I tried to offer support, my voice was buried under the echo of his. She grew up convinced that my words were worthless. She learned that her father held the absolute truth, and that I was just a whisper, a background noise that could be ignored. But over time, that role was taken by someone else, her mother-in-law. When she met the man who would become her husband, I thought life would give her a new direction, perhaps a chance to find a love that would soften her. However, what I found was another long shadow that displaced me even more. Her husband's mother presented herself as a confident, elegant, charming woman. From the first moment, my daughter was captivated by her. I remember her first visit to our house. The woman arrived with a bouquet of flowers and sweet words that sounded false to me from the start. Still, my daughter hugged her enthusiastically, and as soon as she left, she commented, "Did you see how amazing she is? She understands me like no one else." I smiled, though something inside me was tearing apart. That like no one else was a cruel reminder that I had never known how to fill the place she needed. The silences became even more painful after that day. My daughter started spending more time with her mother-in-law than with me. Any important decision she consulted with her first. When she had problems, she ran to seek her advice. I was left on the sidelines, waiting in vain for her to include me, to let me be a part. But all I received were cold silences, glances that passed right through me, short phrases that ended the conversation. The humiliations came later, almost without me realizing it. Comments made out loud in front of other people. My mother-in-law always has the right words. "You wouldn't understand, Mom. She really knows how to organize a party, not like you. I feel more like her daughter than yours." Every sentence was a knife, and I swallowed it in silence. I didn't want to confront her, didn't want to push her further away. I thought if I just endured, if I stayed close one day, she would open her eyes. But time proved me wrong. Silence became a habit. I would visit her and she would barely say a few words to me. I would accompany her to her events, and she would relegate me to a corner. In family photos, I was the figure cut off at the edges. I didn't even realize that I was being slowly erased until it became obvious that I was an extra in my own life. The worst part was that I started to believe her. There came a point where I myself thought that I didn't deserve to be there, that maybe it was true, that I hadn't been enough, that my mistakes had outweighed my successes. I sank into a quiet sadness, into a bitter acceptance that my place had been taken, and that no one, not even my daughter, would fight to give it back to me. But what happened on her birthday changed something inside me. When she told me in front of everyone that I could leave, the silence broke. It was like being hit head-on with the evidence of what I had tolerated for years. And then my daughter-in-law appeared unexpectedly, with a voice that challenged that custom of silence. She spoke when I had already forgotten how. In that moment, I understood something crucial. My silences had been my prison. I had locked myself in them, believing that being quiet was the way to keep my daughter. But being quiet only stripped me of my dignity. Now I knew that if I wanted to reclaim what was left of me, I had to speak. Even if no one wanted to listen, even if it hurt, I had to do it. The weight of the silences had crushed me for decades, but now, finally, I was ready to break them. And I would do it with the truth, even if that truth burned down everything my daughter had built. I will never forget the look on my daughter's face when my daughter-in-law snatched the microphone from her that night. She, used to being the center of everything to no one contradicting her, was frozen. For a second, I thought my daughter-in-law would just make a trivial comment, maybe a forced compliment. But what came out of her mouth was a flood of truths that no one expected. And every word was a whip that echoed off the walls of the room. "Today is your birthday." My daughter-in-law said, her voice trembling but firm, "and it's right that you receive love. But it's also right that you face what you've tried to hide for so long." The murmur among the guests stopped. Glasses were left midair. Laughter died in many throats. I felt my heart race as if it wanted to escape my chest. Something big was about to happen, and for the first time I wasn't the protagonist of the humiliation, but a witness to a truth that was pulling me from the shadows into the light. My daughter tried to regain control. She approached her with a tense smile. "What are you saying? Don't make a drama out of my party." But my daughter-in-law didn't stop. I saw her grip the microphone with both hands as if she were holding a weapon. "Your mother gave you everything she had," she continued. "And you, instead of thanking her, have made her your target of contempt. You have allowed others to humiliate her, and you joined in the mockery as if it were a sport. Do you know what it's like to see a mother leave your house in tears because you treated her like a stranger? I know, because I have seen it." A murmur of surprise swept through the room. My throat was tight and I could barely breathe. I never expected that defense. I had never imagined that someone, least of all my daughter-in-law, would have the courage to expose in front of everyone what I had suffered in silence. My daughter, nervous, looked at the guests. "Don't listen to her," she said with a forced laugh. "She always exaggerates." But my daughter-in-law took a step forward and lowered her voice as if speaking directly to her. "It's not an exaggeration. It's the truth you've hidden under your parties and your applause." The tension became unbearable. I could see my daughter's mother-in-law sitting upright in her chair, her lips tight and her eyes furious. She couldn't stand her kingdom of perfection being shaken, and my daughter, seeing herself exposed, began to lose control. "Shut up already," she screamed at her. "This is not your moment." My daughter-in-law looked at her calmly, and it was that calmness that made her tremble even more. "No, this is not my moment," she replied. "It's your mother's, the one you took from her years ago." The words hung in the air like a verdict. I felt my legs tremble, but not from weakness, but from a strength I didn't remember feeling in a long time. It was as if my daughter-in-law's voice had given me back the dignity I had buried myself. The guests didn't know where to look. Some looked at me with pity, others with shame, others with a mix of surprise and respect. No one dared to applaud this time. It was too real, too raw. My daughter, on the other hand, was falling apart. I saw her face change from anger to humiliation, from arrogance to desperation. She was not prepared for someone to confront her, much less in front of everyone. She had always lived believing she could manage appearances, that with a fake smile she could hide the rot she carried inside. But that night the masks shattered. I wanted to speak. I wanted to take that moment to say what I had kept inside for years, but I held back. It wasn't my turn yet. Sometimes the greatest act of power is a well-used silence. My daughter-in-law had lit the fuse, and I had to wait for the exact moment for the explosion to become my weapon. My daughter tried to compose herself, and in a desperate attempt, she hugged her mother-in-law in front of everyone. "She is the mother I always wanted," she said, almost shouting. "I don't need anything else." But the sentence sounded hollow, empty. No one believed her because after what my daughter-in-law had revealed, everyone knew it was nothing more than a childish defense, a final grasp in the water before sinking. I watched her in silence with a mix of pain and pity. On one hand, she was still my daughter, the little girl I once held in my arms and rocked on feverish nights. But on the other hand, I no longer recognized her. She was a woman consumed by her own pride, unable to see beyond her ego. That night, I knew that the war between us was no longer invisible. It was now public. And in a public war, the winner isn't the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who knows how to wait and strike at the right moment. My daughter-in-law looked at me from the stage, and in her eyes I saw something I had never seen before. Complicity. As if she were telling me without words that I wasn't alone, that there was someone willing to bear witness to what I had lived through. And then I understood that this birthday, which had started as my condemnation, had become my opportunity. Because my daughter-in-law's words were not the end of the humiliation, but the beginning of my revenge. That night, after the birthday party, I returned home with an exhausted body and a wounded heart, but also with my mind on fire. My daughter-in-law's words had opened a crack in the facade my daughter had built for years. And as I took off my dress and let down my hair in front of the mirror, the memories began to fall on me like stones. Scenes from a past that never healed its wounds, episodes that had marked me like invisible scars. I close my eyes and see her as a little girl, barely 5 years old, running towards me with a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked in the garden. "You're the best mom in the world," she told me then with a smile that lit up my soul. That memory haunts me because it shows me there was a time when I did mean everything to her. And it hurts to ask myself, at what point did I stop being that for her? As the years went by, the sweet gestures faded. I remember her adolescence as a particularly cruel stage. There were days she would come home from school, throw her backpack on the couch, and walk right past me without a greeting, without a look. I would try to approach her, ask how her day was, if she needed anything. She would respond with one-word answers, or with that silence that hurt more than any insult. One day when she was 15, we argued because she came home late. I was worried. I waited up for her with the table set. When she walked in, I asked her to explain where she had been. She looked at me with a mix of annoyance and contempt and said, "You're nobody to ask me that." That sentence broke me in two. It wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was a conscious rejection, a direct cut to my role as a mother. That night I cried in silence with the table set and the cold food still on the plates. Another episode was seared into my skin like a burn. It was at her high school graduation. I worked so hard to prepare everything. Her dress, the dinner, the details I thought would make her happy. And at the end of the event, when the organizers asked the students to come up on stage with their parents, she looked for her father first. I went up too, but when I tried to take her hand, she discreetly pulled it away. No one noticed except me, and that gesture so small broke my heart. It was as if she wanted to erase me even from the photos that would immortalize her in that important moment. The following years were a collection of small and large wounds. I remember going to her house when she was already living with her husband. I brought a dessert I had made with love, thinking it would make her happy. As soon as she opened the door, she looked me up and down and said, "Oh, Mom, don't you ever get tired of playing the good guy? Nobody needs your things here." And she took the tray from my hands without looking me in the eyes. I stood in the hallway with a frozen smile as I heard her say to her mother-in-law in the kitchen, "Look at her still trying to be relevant." I remember that sentence as if it were yesterday. Each wound built a wall between us. I tried to tear it down with patience, with love, with resigned silences. But my daughter added new stones with every slight. It reached a point where I understood that she didn't want reconciliation. That her choice was clear. She had decided to give another woman the place that belonged to me. And the worst part was that she did it with a cruelty that seemed to seek my total surrender. On those lonely nights, I wondered if I had failed as a mother, if maybe I hadn't given her enough, or if I had overprotected her too much. Guilt devoured me. I thought that my own past, my broken childhood, had marked the way I raised her. Maybe without realizing it, I had suffocated her with my fears. And she found in her mother-in-law the free and confident figure I could never be. But then I would remember everything I sacrificed, The years of work, the sleepless nights, the dreams I locked away in a drawer so she could achieve hers. And I understood that no, it wasn't a lack of love or dedication. The problem was that in her ambition for recognition, she chose to deny her roots. I was the uncomfortable part of her story, the one she preferred to hide in order to shine in front of others. Those open wounds never closed, and on her birthday, they all bled at once. When she told me in front of everyone that I could leave, it wasn't just a humiliation. It was the cruel summary of years of accumulated contempt. But the difference now was that I wasn't going to stay silent anymore, because those wounds, though they hurt, had also made me strong. Every hidden tear, every swallowed insult, every averted gaze had forged me like iron. And if my daughter thought she could still break me, she was wrong. Now, I was the one ready to break the silence, to raise my voice, to use the truth as a weapon. That night, I promised myself there would be no more tears in vain. The wounds would still be there, yes, but they would not be signs of defeat. They would be my battle scars. And with them, I would march onto the battlefield that awaited me, the one of the truth that had not yet been revealed. Pain teaches you, but humiliation sharpens you. And after that party, when I heard my daughter tell me in public that I could leave, I understood that the time had come to turn my scars into weapons. I could no longer wait for gratitude where there was only contempt. I had been silent for too long. I had endured slights that marked me like a branding iron. But that night, with my daughter-in-law's words echoing in my mind, I decided I would no longer be a victim. A plan began to form in silence. It wasn't the first time I had thought about defending myself, but I always lacked the courage. This time, however, anger was my engine. I was no longer seeking reconciliation or tenderness. I was seeking justice. The first thing I did was open the drawers of my memory, the ones I had kept shut for fear of what I might find. I remembered that my husband, before he died, had left a trail of financial secrets, shady investments, and documents that he always hid with jealousy. For years, I chose not to look, not to ask, because I told myself it was men's business. But now I understood that in those papers could be my most powerful weapon. I started visiting the office that had been abandoned in the house. The smell of dust and old paper accompanied me as I went through yellowish folders, sealed envelopes, and contracts I had never dared to read. At first, I felt lost, like an intruder in my own home. But with patience, I began to decipher each line, each number, each signature. I discovered that my husband had made deals with my daughter's in-laws' financial favors that tied our destinies together more than I ever wanted. And there was the irony. The mother-in-law she now revered owed me more than she would ever admit. That was dynamite, and I knew it the moment I read it. I didn't want to rush. I sought help quietly. I contacted an old trusted friend, a retired lawyer who had always respected me. I took the documents to him and asked him to explain what they really meant. I remember him looking at me with wide eyes. "Do you have any idea what you're holding here?" he said. "With this, you could ruin your daughter, her husband, and even her in-laws." I felt a chill, not because it scared me, but because for the first time I understood that I held the power in my hands. I then began to map out my strategy. I made copies of everything. I secured them in different places. I even gave a sealed envelope to my lawyer with clear instructions in case something happened to me. It wasn't paranoia, it was caution. I knew my daughter's arrogance and her mother-in-law's cunning all too well. If they found out what I knew, they wouldn't hesitate to attack me with everything they had. Meanwhile, in public, I continued to play the role of the fragile, almost invisible mother. I attended family gatherings. I smiled when I had to. I lowered my head to avoid raising suspicion. No one imagined that behind that facade, every gesture, every word, every look was being calculated. The key to everything was patience. I knew my daughter would make mistakes. Her arrogance made her careless, and her need to prove she didn't need me would lead her to step on dangerous ground. I just had to wait for the right moment to reveal what I held in my hands. At night, as I went over my plan again and again, I found myself thinking about the past. How had we gotten here? How had that little girl who used to hug me in her sleep turned into a woman capable of throwing me out of her life as if I were a burden? Sometimes the pain almost made me hesitate. But then I would remember every slight, every look of superiority, and my resolve would turn to steel. I also thought a lot about my daughter-in-law. Her bravery at the birthday party had been the spark that lit the fuse of my plan. I wondered what motivated her to speak up like that, whether she did it for me or because she had also suffered at my daughter's hands. I didn't know, but I was sure of one thing. That woman who at first seemed like a stranger could be an unexpected ally. The plan wasn't just about exposing the financial and social truth of my daughter and her mother-in-law. No, it was bigger. I wanted to dismantle the facade of perfection they had built at the cost of my humiliation. I wanted everyone, absolutely everyone, to see what was hidden behind those applauses, those fake smiles, and those empty speeches. Once in front of the mirror, I dared to speak aloud, as if rehearsing for the day of revelation. "I don't want your affection," I said, imagining my daughter in front of me. "I don't need your applause. The only thing I demand is respect, and if you don't know how to give it to me, I will take it from you with the truth." That mirror was my accomplice for weeks. I practiced words, gestures, even silences. I would not improvise. When the time came, every sentence had to be precise. Every pause had to sink her deeper into her own lie. And while everything was brewing in the shadows, I smiled in public, accepted the slights, pretended not to hear the mockery. Inside, however, I repeated over and over again, "Wait, Elizabeth, wait. Your moment will come." That moment was closer than anyone could imagine. There are conversations a mother never wants to have with her daughter. For years I dreamed of us sitting face to face, talking without shouting or reproaches, and maybe crying together to heal the wounds we carried. But when I finally gathered the courage to seek her out, I understood that all I would find was a cruel mirror. My daughter reflecting in her hardness and contempt the worst of her father and the woman she now called mother. I invited her to my house, to the living room that had seen us share simple birthdays, afternoons of homework, and Sunday movies so many times. She arrived late as always, with an arrogant expression, an expensive perfume filling every corner. She didn't even apologize. She sat on the sofa not as a guest, but as an owner, and crossed her legs with an air that I found unbearable. "What do you want now, Mom?" she asked with that impatient tone that had pierced me like a needle so many times. "I'm busy." I looked at her in silence for a few seconds. She had so much of me in her features that it hurt. The same dark hair, the same broad forehead. But in her eyes there was no tenderness or recognition. There was coldness. "I wanted to talk to you," I finally said. "Not as enemies, but as mother and daughter." She laughed, a dry laugh that tore me apart inside. "Mother and daughter. We stopped being that a long time ago." I bit my lip. I didn't want to cry, not in front of her. "Why, Sarah? Why do you hate me so much?" Her reply was a look full of resentment. "Because you were never enough, always small, always faded, always begging for a place. Dad was right. You were a burden, and I didn't want to be like you." I felt the blow like a hammer to my stomach. To hear from her mouth the same words her father had thrown at me so many times was unbearable. It was like reliving all the years of humiliation, but amplified in the voice of my own blood. "Everything I did was for you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I gave up my dreams, my life, so you could have what I never had." "And what good did it do?" she interrupted. "You never gave me what I really needed. Pride. I found that with my other mother. She taught me to be strong, not to depend on anyone to have presence. You, on the other hand, were always in everyone's shadow." Her words made me tremble, but they also ignited something in me. "Presence," I said, raising my voice. "You call stepping on your own mother presence, erasing your history. That woman wasn't with you on feverish nights. She didn't walk you to school in the rain. She didn't sell her things to buy your books. That woman only showed up when you were already made, when it was easy to latch on to your pride." She looked away, uncomfortable for the first time, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "What's done is done. You chose to be invisible. Don't blame me for finding another figure who represented me better." I stood there frozen. It was the confirmation that I had lost her, that no word, no memory, no sacrifice could reverse the wall she had built between us. However, something changed in me in that moment. I no longer felt sadness. I felt rage, a cold, calculated rage that didn't lead to shouting or pleading, but to the certainty that I had to move forward with my plan. She had made her decision to disown me. I would make mine. To show her that not everything in life can be erased or replaced. "Fine," I said, standing up. "If that's what you think, then there's nothing more to talk about." She smiled with that triumphant smirk I knew all too well. "Finally, you get it." But she didn't get it at all, because while she thought she had defeated me, I already held in my hands the pieces that would bring down the castle of arrogance she had built with her mother-in-law. I walked her to the door. Before she left, she turned and threw one last dagger. "When I talk about my mother, I'm not thinking of you. Get used to it." I closed the door slowly, my heart on fire. I leaned against the wood and let out a deep sigh. I didn't cry. Not anymore. Because instead of tears, what ran through me was a new energy, an absolute certainty. She had given me the reason not to stop. In that moment, I understood that my daughter had become a mirror of everything I hated. Her father's arrogance, her mother-in-law's manipulation, the coldness of misunderstood power. And I would no longer try to save her from herself. My mission was now different. To rip that mirror away and show it to her in front of everyone, even if it was the last thing I ever did. Because if she wanted to see me as a shadow, she would learn that shadows also know how to swallow everything until they suffocate the light that thinks it's eternal. Just when I thought everything would end with that private confrontation with my daughter, the unexpected voice of my daughter-in-law appeared again. Chloe, who had lit the first spark at that birthday party, returned with even greater force. And this time she didn't just speak for me. She spoke against the entire facade that my daughter and her mother-in-law had built for years. It happened at a family gathering, one of those that seemed designed to display a perfect portrait. It was my daughter and her husband's wedding anniversary, and the room was decorated with a luxury that bordered on ostentatious. Guests imported flowers, cameras capturing every gesture. I had decided to attend not out of affection, but because I knew that such occasions were the ideal stage for masks to crack. And I was not wrong. My daughter's mother-in-law, dressed in an elegant suit and a rehearsed smile, paraded like a queen among the guests. My daughter followed her like a satellite, celebrating every word, every gesture, as if she were the only sun that lit up her life. I sat in a corner, invisible as usual, but with my eyes wide open. I waited. It was then that my daughter-in-law, dressed simply, but with the dignity of someone who needs no adornments, stood up from her table. Her clear voice asked for silence. No one understood what was about to happen, but everyone complied. "There are things that must be said," she began, "because you can't live forever behind appearances." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the room. My daughter's mother-in-law raised her eyebrows, surprised. My daughter turned pale, perhaps remembering the scene from her birthday. I, on the other hand, leaned forward, my heart pounding. I knew something big was about to erupt. "You," my daughter-in-law continued, looking directly at the mother-in-law, "have played the part of the perfect mother for years, the flawless woman, the figure everyone should admire. But I know what you're hiding. I know about the accounts you moved in secret, the shady business deals you dragged your son into, and consequently my husband. And I also know how you manipulated my sister-in-law, making her believe you were the only mother she deserved." A chilling silence filled the room. I saw the mother-in-law's smile shatter, her face tense with restrained fury. My daughter, desperate, tried to interrupt her. "That's enough. What are you trying to do with all this? This is ridiculous." But my daughter-in-law did not stop. "What I'm trying to do is get to the truth. Or do you want me to show the documents I have because I have them? I've seen transfers, contracts with fake names, agreements signed behind the family's back." The guests began to murmur. Some discreetly took out their phones. Others exchanged looks of astonishment. The perfect scene was crumbling like a house of cards in a sudden breeze. I watched it all with a mix of dizziness and satisfaction. I hadn't lifted a finger. But my daughter-in-law was fighting the battle I had planned in silence. It was as if fate had placed an ally in my path that I never sought someone who had also suffered under that family's manipulations and was no longer willing to be silent. The mother-in-law finally stood up. Her voice, thick with anger, echoed through the room. "This is slander, a lie invented to destroy me." But her hands were trembling. That tremor was the clearest confession. She was afraid. My daughter ran to her, hugged her in front of everyone, as if that gesture could protect her. "Don't listen to her," she shouted. "It's just envy, a trap." However, her words no longer carried the same weight. No one listened to her with credibility. The shadow of doubt had fallen upon her impeccable stage, and in those circles, a shadow is enough to extinguish all the lights. Sitting in silence, let it all happen. I didn't need to intervene. It was like watching a chessboard, where without moving my pieces, I saw the enemy's pieces fall one by one. When she finished, my daughter-in-law left the microphone and walked out of the room. She didn't seek my gaze. She didn't wait for applause or support. She simply left with the serenity of someone who has cleared her conscience. When the door closed behind her, chaos erupted. Guests murmuring, others leaving with quick excuses, journalists improvising headlines in their heads. The mother-in-law tried to compose herself, but it was too late. Her image of perfection was stained, and my daughter, her eyes glassy with rage, looked at me as if it were all my fault. In her eyes I read hatred, a hatred so deep it chilled my blood. But I also saw something else, fear. Because even if she wouldn't admit it, she knew my daughter-in-law's words had substance. And what she didn't know was that I also had documents, evidence, secrets that could finish sinking her. That night, returning home, I thought about my daughter-in-law's courage. She had taken a step I still didn't dare to take. I wondered if she had done it only for personal revenge or if somehow she had also done it for me. It didn't matter. The truth is that her voice opened a door that no one could close again. The family war was no longer a private whisper. Now it was exposed, bleeding in front of everyone. And I, who had lived for years under the weight of silence, understood that my moment was near. Because when the truth starts to come out, there is no one who can stop it. All my life, I was afraid of public stages. I was always the woman who stayed on the sidelines, the one who avoided being the center of attention, who preferred to support others from the shadows rather than claim a space of her own. But that night, as I entered the room crowded with partners, friends, and relatives, I knew I couldn't hide anymore. The murmur was deafening, a mix of curiosity and anxiety. Since my daughter-in-law's confession weeks ago, nothing had been the same. Everyone expected explanations. Everyone wanted to see how this drama, which no one could ignore anymore, would end. And in the midst of those expectant gazes, I found myself on a stage with a folder under my arm that felt heavier than any memory. That folder contained not just papers, but decades of silences, humiliations, and wounds that were now transforming into my only language of justice. I took a deep breath and looked at the scene. I saw my daughter rigid in her seat, her eyes as cold as knives, and her body as tense as a bow about to break. Beside her, her mother-in-law stood with a stone face, trying to project dignity, though I noticed a slight tremor in her hands. Both faces reminded me of years of disrespect, the gestures of superiority, the looks that reduced me to a shadow, the words that condemned me to oblivion. And there they were, exposed before an audience that was beginning to suspect that this family perfection was nothing more than a facade. I opened the folder, and the sound of the rustling paper was like a gunshot that pierced the silence. "I have been silent for too long," I said with a firm voice, although my insides were trembling. I was silent when my husband humiliated me, when my daughter pushed me away, when this family reduced me to nothing. I was silent, out of love, out of fear, and out of habit, but no more. Today I have come to speak, and what I am about to say will forever change the way you see those who have disrespected me. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Some heads leaned forward expectant. Others discreetly drew back, fearing the scandal that was coming. Calmly, I unfolded the documents. They were not rumors, not insinuations. They were contracts, bank transfers, financial records. My husband's inheritance and the economic dealings of my daughter's mother-in-law's family were tainted with irregularities. I had discovered it among dusty papers that no one expected me to check, but there it was, the truth they had hidden for years, now turned into my sword. My daughter shot up from her seat, her voice filled with rage. "Lies! This is all lies!" I looked at her without blinking and held up one of the documents. "A lie. Then explain to them why your signature appears here, authorizing transactions you never declared. Explain to them, not to me, why you agreed to cover for your father when he asked you to sign in his place." The color drained from her face. Her entire body shuddered. For a moment her lips moved, but no words came out. The audience understood. The seed of doubt was planted, and doubt, once it takes root, is more destructive than any shout. The mother-in-law stood up, arrogant, her voice dripping with contempt. "This is a setup," she said. "A personal vendetta from a resentful woman." Then I pointed at her with the calmness of someone who knows they have already won. "If it were a setup, why are your hands shaking?" The murmur erupted among the guests. Some exclaimed in surprise, others exchanged looks of disbelief. The perfect image of that woman was crumbling in a matter of seconds. It no longer mattered what she said. The tremor in her hands spoke louder than her voice. I took a few seconds of silence, just enough for the tension to build to an unbearable level. Then I added, "I am not looking for pity or cheap revenge. The only thing I want is for the truth to come to light. And here it is in these papers that will be validated by notaries in these documents that cannot be erased or ignored. They wanted to erase me, but you can't erase memory. And today that memory lays you bare in front of everyone." The notaries present confirmed the authenticity of the documents. The partners, outraged, began to murmur among themselves. Some even left the room in a hurry. Those who stayed looked at my daughter with a mixture of contempt and disappointment. She collapsed into her chair, her eyes overflowing with tears, not of remorse but of rage. The mother-in-law, on the other hand, tried to keep her head high, but fear shone in her eyes. She knew the mask had fallen. I closed the folder and placed it on the table with a sharp thud, as if to say, "It is all said." I didn't need to shout. My calm, measured voice was more devastating than their screams of desperation. I walked towards the exit while the room stirred with whispers, accusing looks, and the echo of a truth that no one could stop now. Before leaving, I turned one last time. I looked at my daughter curled up in her seat, her face buried in her hands. My voice was clear, firm, final. "I did not leave, and I will never leave. I am your mother, even if you deny me, even if you hate me, and my voice will always haunt you." And then I walked through the door. Outside, the night was cold, but in my chest a flame was burning that would never be extinguished. It wasn't joy I felt, nor peace. It was justice. A justice that had taken years to arrive, but that finally rose with the force of thunder. The night after the public judgment was the first in many years that I slept without being startled awake. I didn't dream of shouting or disrespect or scenes where my daughter turned her back on me. I didn't dream of anything, and that emptiness was more restorative than any illusion. Upon waking, however, I understood there was still one step left. I had unmasked my daughter and her mother-in-law. I had returned the truth to the place from which they had torn it. But I still had to decide what to do with what was left to me. My inheritance, my name, my legacy. For decades I believed that assets were something distant from me, that everything belonged to my husband, that I was just the invisible guardian keeping them in order. But now in my hands were the deeds, the accounts, the contracts that proved that a large part of that fortune, directly or indirectly, belonged to me. And yet what I valued most was not the money, it was the opportunity to decide. That decision, which had been denied to me my entire life, was finally mine. I didn't want to repeat history. I didn't want to perpetuate the chain of arrogance and contempt that had destroyed my family. If my daughter had denied me as a mother, I would deny her as an heir. I met with my lawyer in his office. He placed a draft of a will on the table that we had already worked on in secret weeks before. I read it slowly, savoring every word. It stated with complete clarity that my daughter was excluded from the inheritance, that she would not receive a single dollar or a single property. Everything would go to a foundation for young orphans and female victims of violence. A smaller but significant portion would be left to my daughter-in-law, the only one who had the courage to speak up when everyone else was silent. My lawyer looked at me cautiously, as if he feared I would change my mind. "Are you absolutely sure?" he asked. I nodded firmly. "More sure than anything else in my life. My grandchildren will have to make their own way without depending on a last name. And my daughter will learn, even if it's late, that not everything in this life can be bought with arrogance." I signed the document with a calmness that surprised me. It was like closing a circle that had been open for decades, as if with that signature I was burying once and for all the shadow of my husband and the wound my daughter had left me. For the first time, I felt that I was not the one obeying, but the one deciding. The following days were a whirlwind of rumors. The news leaked quickly. The widow had disinherited her only daughter. The local papers published it, some with scandalous headlines, others with an almost poetic tone. Society, which had so eagerly applauded my daughter's union with her perfect mother-in-law, now reveled in the fall of her mask. And in the midst of all that commotion, I remained calm, watching from my window as the storm raged outside. It didn't take long for the reaction to come. One afternoon, my daughter burst into my house unannounced. She was distraught, her eyes red from crying or screaming, I don't know which. She confronted me in the living room with the fury of someone who feels everything she had is slipping through her fingers. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed. "I'm your daughter, your only daughter." I looked at her calmly. "Daughter, do you remember that night when you said in front of everyone that I could leave? That day, you were the one who gave up on me." Her lips trembled. She tried to reply but found no words. I continued speaking this time without trembling, without fear. "You had me your whole life, and you despised me. Now you will have to learn what it means to live without me, without my support, without my inheritance. Maybe then you will understand the value of what you lost." She stood there for a few seconds, as if waiting for me to break down to regret it to run and hug her. But I didn't. I remained upright with my head held high, showing her that the invisible woman no longer existed. Finally, she slammed the door on her way out, and her fury was trapped within the walls, while I was left in peace. Over time, my decision began to bear fruit. The foundation I created opened its doors. Children who had never had a home found shelter. Women who had been silenced regained their voice. And I, seeing their illuminated faces, understood that this was the true legacy I wanted to leave. Not riches stained with deceit, not the empty titles of a broken family, but something that truly transformed lives. Sometimes at night I think about my daughter. I wonder if she will ever understand that what I did was not out of hatred but out of justice. Maybe one day she will understand. Maybe never. It no longer matters to me. My life can no longer revolve around her contempt. Now it revolves around something bigger, my reclaimed dignity. I look at myself in the mirror, and I no longer see the broken woman who begged for love. I see someone who survived humiliation, who walked through the shadows and knew how to wait for the moment to rise. And although I know that loneliness will continue to accompany me, I am not afraid of it. I prefer dignified solitude to poisoned company. That is my true triumph. That when people speak of me, they don't remember me as the forgotten mother, but as the woman who refused to be erased, who transformed pain into justice, and who even when wounded knew how to stand up. That is my legacy.